I stood in the center of the clearing, my boots sinking into 6 inches of premium charcoal gray rubber mulch that, according to the legal papers in my hand, I now owned. Opposite me stood Candace Johnson. She was the president of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association, a woman who wore authority like a tailored suit and viewed the surrounding 3 acres of ancient oak trees as her personal kingdom. Behind her, a dozen angry residents in golf shirts and yoga gear glared at me like I was a barbarian at the gates. "You have 10 seconds to get off this equipment, Mr. Gordon," Candace said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. She gestured to the massive, multi-level cedar play structure behind me, a $50,000 crown jewel of the neighborhood. "This is Common Area A. It is private, it is insured, and you are currently committing criminal trespass." I didn't move. I just held up a yellowed, crinkled copy of a land survey from 1998. "Actually, Candace, I'm standing in my backyard," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Your developer made a typo 25 years ago. A missing zero in a legal description. You've been mowing my lawn and building playgrounds on my dirt for 2 decades without paying a cent in property taxes. The city seized this ghost parcel 3 years ago, and I just bought the whole thing at a tax auction for the price of a used sedan." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack the pavement of the nearby cul-de-sac. I watched the blood drain from her face as she looked from the private property sign in my hand to the massive crane idling at the edge of the woods. "And since I'm not a member of your HOA," I continued, "I don't have to follow your rules. The crane is here to dismantle your park. I'm donating the whole thing to a youth center downtown. The IRS told me the tax deduction will probably pay for my new kitchen." I checked my watch. "You have 9 seconds left to get your lawn chairs off my lot." Today's story is a doozy that begins with a long, forgotten grove of woods that spirals into a battle between the purchaser and the nearby HOA. The HOA has been using it for years as if it were theirs, only to find it was city property all along and sold as part of a city land cleanup. It comes from Joseph Gordon, a man with a quiet, patient obsession for the digital ghosts hidden deep within county land records and outdated GIS mapping software. Driven by a fascination for the overlooked slivers of the world that modern bureaucracy accidentally left unlabeled, Joseph spends his nights hunting for the clerical errors and ghost parcels that the rest of the world has simply walked over for decades. For him, a misplaced coordinate or a missing zero in a legal description isn't just a mistake. It's an invitation to claim a stake in a landscape that usually belongs only to the highest bidder, proving that sometimes the most valuable treasure isn't buried in the dirt, but in the fine print. I've always had a thing for digital ghosts. While most guys my age spend their Friday nights scrolling through sports scores or chasing ghosts in video games, I'm usually hunched over a dual monitor setup, deep diving into the county's GIS mapping system. There's a strange, quiet thrill in finding a sliver, a piece of dirt that the modern world simply forgot to label. "Joe, you're doing it again," my brother had told me last week, leaning against my doorframe with a look of pity. "Searching for buried treasure in a spreadsheet. Just buy a metal detector like a normal midlife crisis sufferer. At least then you'd get some sun." But I didn't need a metal detector. I had something better. The city of Riverside's annual tax delinquent job lot auction list. In the high-stakes, low-glamour world of U.S. tax auctions, a job lot is where the city sweeps up all the weird, unwanted scraps of the urban landscape. It's a clearance bin for real estate. They bundle together unbuildable triangles of weeds, narrow strips of land under power lines that no one can touch, and remnants left over from bankrupt developers. You bid on the whole mess for the price of the back taxes, interest, and a few $100s in administrative fees. Usually, it's a pile of expensive garbage that costs more to mow than it's worth. But then I saw parcel ID hashtag 45.9 922.100.1 000.4. On the satellite view, it looked like a mapping glitch. It was a lush, 3-acre grove of ancient, deep green oaks and thick maples, shaped like a jagged tooth. To the north, it was bordered by a state-protected creek that ran silver under the sun. To the south, east, and west, it was hugged by the pristine boundaries of Oak Creek Estates, the kind of homeowners association where the grass is measured with a literal ruler and the mailboxes all cost more than my first car. According to the city's dusty digital records, this grove was owner unknown surplus. It had been sitting there, gathering unpaid tax bills for 25 years because a developer named Miller Vane went belly up in the late 90s. When the company dissolved, this parcel seemingly evaporated from their books. The starting bid for the entire job lot, which included two useless gravel pits in the middle of nowhere and this 3-acre forest, was $4,200, roughly the cost of a decade-old hatchback with high mileage. The auction was held in a cramped, wood-paneled room in the basement of City Hall. It smelled of damp coats, floor wax, and the quiet desperation of men hoping to strike it rich on a foreclosed parking space. There were only 4 other bidders, mostly guys in stained trucker caps looking for cheap storage lots or junk land. They could flip to a neighbor for a quick grand. I sat in the back row, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. When lot number 14 finally came up, the auctioneer didn't even look up from his clipboard. He had the bored, rhythmic drone of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Lot 14, various surplus parcels, including the Miller Vein remnants and the Miller Road easements. Total acreage across 4 parcels, 5.2. Minimum bid 4,200. Do I hear 42? I raised my hand. My palm was so slick with sweat, I almost lost my grip on my bidder card. 4,200 to the gentleman in the back. Any advance on 42? The room stayed silent. One guy checked his watch and sighed. Another coughed into his hand. To them, Miller Vein remnants sounded like a liability, a swampy mess, or a legal headache. They didn't see the jagged tooth of green I'd found on the GIS map. Going once at 4,200. Going twice. The wooden gavel hit the desk with a sharp crack that echoed in my chest. Sold to bidder number 87. I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly, and walked to the clerk's desk. I signed a thick stack of papers, half of which I barely read in my adrenaline-fueled haze, and handed over a cashier's check for $4,200. That check represented nearly every cent of my new life fund, the money I'd scraped together after my divorce and the sale of my old condo. I was now the legal owner of 2 useless holes in the ground and a prime piece of forest nestled inside the wealthiest zip code in the county. As I walked out into the bright, biting afternoon sun, clutching my certificate of sale, I pulled up the map on my phone one more time. The Grove was right there, tucked behind a row of million-dollar mansions with their architecturally approved beige siding and perfectly mulched flower beds. I didn't know yet about the $50,000 playground that sat right in the middle of my new dirt. I didn't know about the Scrivener's error in the 1998 plat that had hidden this land in plain sight for 2 decades. And I definitely didn't know that by Monday morning, I'd be the most hated man in the history of Oak Creek Estates. I just knew that for $4,000, I finally had a place to build something of my own. I had a deed, I had the law, and for the first time in years, I had the upper hand. The drive to Oak Creek Estates took 20 minutes, but it felt like crossing into a different dimension. I watched the landscape shift from the cracked asphalt and gray, weather-worn strip malls of my neighborhood to winding tree-lined boulevards where the potholes had been filled so seamlessly they were invisible. The street lamps weren't the buzzing orange hums I was used to. They were elegant black iron lanterns that looked like they belonged in a Victorian London set. I pulled my dented silver sedan over to the curb at the end of a cul-de-sac called Heritage Way. My GPS gave a satisfied chime, telling me I had arrived at my destination. Looking out the window, my eyes told a very different story than the satellite map. Directly in front of me was a perfectly manicured trailhead. A hand-painted wooden sign, dripping with expensive gold leaf lettering, hung from 2 cedar posts that were carved with the neighborhood's crest. It read, "Welcome to Common Area A. Oak Creek residents only. No soliciting. No trespassing." Beyond the sign, a winding gravel path. Not just any gravel, but polished gray river stones, led into the dense woods I supposedly owned. I stepped out of the car, clutching my manila folder of auction papers against my chest like a shield. My heart was thumping against my ribs. Legally, I was the landlord here, but standing there in my faded jeans and a charcoal hoodie, I felt like a thief breaking into a vault. I followed the path. About 50 yards in, the trees opened up into a clearing that made my jaw drop. It wasn't just a grove. It was a 5-star resort for toddlers. There was a massive, multi-level play structure made of weather-resistant cedar, featuring 3 spiral slides, a rock climbing wall, and a set of 6 heavy-duty swings. Underneath it wasn't dirt or wood chips, but 6 inches of premium charcoal gray rubberized safety mulch. The kind of stuff that probably cost more per square foot than my entire auction bid. To the side sat a heavy timber gazebo with built-in benches and a stone fire pit that looked like it had been installed by a master mason. "Can I help you?" The voice was like a shard of ice dropped down my collar. I spun around, nearly dropping my folder. Standing on the edge of the clearing, near the back fence of a sprawling French provincial mansion, was a woman who radiated the kind of absolute authority usually reserved for high court judges or people who own private islands. She was in her late 50s, wearing a crisp white tennis skirt and a navy cashmere sweater draped perfectly over her shoulders. Her hair was a silver bob so sharp it could have been used to cut tile. "I'm just looking," I said, trying to keep my voice from cracking. "This is private property," she said, stepping forward. Her stride was brisk, purposeful. Her eyes flicked to my rusted sedan visible at the curb, then back to my face with a look of practiced boredom. "The park is for the exclusive use of Oak Creek residents and their invited guests. Are you a guest of the Millers? The Santis? I don't recognize you." "Neither," I said. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and held out my folder. "Actually, I'm Joseph Gordon. I just bought this parcel at the city tax auction this morning. Lot 14. The woman froze. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of something, confusion, or perhaps a flash of genuine alarm, crossed her face. But it was gone in a heartbeat, replaced by a tight, thin-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I think you've made a very embarrassing mistake, Mr. Gordon," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I'm Candace Johnson, president of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association. This is our common area. We've owned, insured, and meticulously maintained this land since the subdivision was chartered in 1998. It is the literal crown jewel of our community. The city records say otherwise," I countered, pulling out the official certificate of sale with the fresh purple ink of the clerk's stamp. It was listed as surplus land from the Miller Vein bankruptcy. The taxes haven't been paid since the Clinton administration. I have the deed, well, the certificate, and once the redemption period passes, I own the dirt. Candace didn't even reach for the paper. She didn't have to. She looked at me like I was a bug she'd found in an expensive organic salad. "Mr. Gordon, I don't know what scrap you think you bought for a few $1,000s in a basement auction, but our legal team vetted every inch of this community decades ago. This grove is the heart of our neighborhood. We pay for the liability insurance, the mulch, the weekly landscaping, and the security patrol that I'm about to call." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low-register whisper. "I suggest you take your little folder and go back to wherever it is you came from before I call the sheriff and have you cited for criminal trespassing. You are not an Oak Creek man, and you certainly do not own our park. This is a misunderstanding that our lawyers will have rectified by Monday morning. I promise you that." She turned on her heel, her white skirt snapping in the breeze, and started walking toward her house, her smartphone already out and pressed to her ear. I could hear her sharp, rhythmic voice reporting a suspicious individual before she even reached her patio. I stood there in the heavy silence of my woods, looking at the $50,000 playground I apparently now owned. I looked at the gold leaf sign and the premium mulch. "Not an Oak Creek man," I muttered to myself, a slow heat rising in my neck. I looked down at my folder. I knew how the city worked. They didn't just sell land by accident. They were too greedy for back taxes to let a 3-acre parcel slip through the cracks unless there was a massive hole in the paperwork. Candace Johnson thought she was defending her kingdom, but she didn't realize she'd just handed me the keys to the castle. And I was already thinking about where I'd put the no trespassing signs. My signs. If you want to kill a king, you don't strike at the crown. You strike at the genealogy. For me, that meant a trip to the County Hall of Records, a brutalist concrete fortress that held the DNA of every property line in the state. I spent the next morning in a basement room that smelled like old tape and stagnant air, hunched over a microfilm reader. Candace Johnson's voice was still ringing in my ears, that sharp, rhythmic, not an Oak Creek man, echoing every time I turned a dial. She was certain of her world. She believed in the ironclad nature of her HOA. But I had seen the tax map, and the tax map never lies. Looking for something specific, or just enjoying the radiation? I looked up. A clerk named Mrs. Gable was watching me. She had bifocals perched on the end of a nose that looked like it had been broken in a high-stakes filing accident. I'm looking for the original 1998 subdivision plat for Miller Vane, I said. The Oak Creek Estates filing. She grunted, disappeared into the stacks, and returned 5 minutes later with a large, yellowed vellum map that crinkled like autumn leaves. People usually only look at these when they're suing their neighbors over a fence line, she noted. Something like that, I muttered. I spread the map out under the desk lamp. It was beautiful in its precision. Hundreds of tiny lots, perfectly numbered, with curved roads named Heritage, Legacy, and Tradition. I found the grove. On this map, it was clearly marked as Common Area A, to be deeded to Homeowners Association upon completion of Phase 1. My heart sank. If it was marked for the HOA, Candace was right. I was just a guy who'd bought a legal headache. But then I saw it. I pulled a magnifying glass from my bag. I traced the boundary lines of the HOA's master deed. The legal description was written in metes and bounds, the old-school way of defining land using coordinates and distances. Thence north, 42 degrees east, 450 feet. Thence west, 2,000 feet, to the point of beginning. I blinked. I looked at the satellite map on my phone, then back at the vellum. I pulled out a pocket calculator and did the math 3 times. Mrs. Gable? I called out, my voice trembling. Can you pull the 1998 deed of transfer from Miller Vane to the Oak Creek HOA? Book 402, page 11. She brought the ledger over. I flipped to the page. There it was. The legal description of the land the developer had officially handed over to the HOA 25 years ago. The developer's lawyer, some overworked junior associate in 1998, had made a typo, a Scrivener's error. Instead of writing west 2,000 feet, which would have included the 3-acre grove, he had typed west 200 feet, a single missing zero. Because of that one missing digit, the HOA's legal border stopped 1,800 feet short of the creek. The grove had never been deeded to the HOA. It had remained in the name of the Miller Vane Development Corporation. And when Miller Vane went bankrupt in 2002, the city eventually seized that forgotten sliver for unpaid taxes. The HOA had been mowing the lawn, building $50,000 playgrounds, and holding wine and cheese mixers on land they didn't legally own. They were squatters in expensive tennis skirts. Is there a problem, honey? Mrs. Gable asked, leaning over my shoulder. No, I said, a slow, predatory grin spreading across my face. No problem at all. I just found out that I don't just own the woods. I own the heart of the kingdom. I paid for high-resolution copies of every document. As I walked out of the Hall of Records into the bright midday sun, I felt 10 feet tall. Candace Johnson was currently sitting in her French provincial mansion, probably drafting a cease and desist letter with her high-priced lawyers. She thought she was playing chess. She didn't realize I'd just discovered she was playing on someone else's board. I got into my car and dialed a number. Hey, Mark, it's Joe. I need you to find me the best land use attorney in the city. Tell him I've got a quiet title action that's going to make the local news. I looked at the folder on the passenger seat. The missing zero was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It's beautiful, Mark said, leaning back in his leather chair. Mark wasn't just a lawyer. He was a shark who specialized in property disputes, the kind of guy who found more joy in a poorly phrased easement than most people found in a lottery win. He tapped the 1998 vellum copy I'd brought him. A classic Scrivener's error. One missing zero and 1,800 feet of prime real estate just falls out of the sky. So they can just fix it, right? I asked. My stomach did a nervous flip. Candice mentioned their legal team. Surely they just file a correction. Mark leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with predatory delight. In 1999? Maybe. But now? Not a chance. See, under the law, if the original parties, the developer and the HOA, were still the only ones involved, they could ask a judge for rectification. They'd argue it was a mutual mistake. But here's the kicker, Joe. You're a bona fide purchaser. I blinked. A what? A BFP, Mark explained, ticking points off his fingers. You bought this land at a public auction, in good faith, for value. You relied on the official county record. The law protects people like you because if anyone could just fix a deed 25 years later, the entire real estate market would collapse. Nobody would ever be sure they actually own their backyard. And the fact that they've been using it? I asked. The playground, the gazebo? Candace was pretty clear about them maintaining it for decades. Mark let out a bark of a laugh. That's the best part. Usually, they'd claim adverse possession, squatters' rights. But because of that typo, the land sat in legal limbo. When the developer vanished, the city eventually stepped in for the back taxes. You cannot claim adverse possession against government-owned land. Nullum Tempus occurret regi, Joe. No time runs against the king. The HOA's 20 years of mowing and mulching? Legally speaking, they were just being very generous volunteers for the city of Riverside. I felt a surge of adrenaline. So, the playground is mine? The playground, the gazebo, the fancy gravel path, and every single oak tree, Mark confirmed. It's all fixtures. They're attached to the land. When you bought the dirt, you bought the toys. I sat there for a moment, letting it sink in. Candace Johnson had spent 20 years polishing a crown that didn't belong to her. And I was the guy who had just walked off with the jewels. What's the move? I asked. Mark pulled a fresh yellow legal pad toward him. First, we file a quiet title action. We ask the court to officially declare you the sole owner and quiet any potential claims from the HOA. But while that's working through the system, we need to establish dominance. You need to stop being a guy with a folder and start being a guy with a project. I was thinking about a cabin, I said. Something modern, sustainable, right in the middle of the grove. Mark grinned. Perfect. Go to the city building department. Apply for a residential permit. When the city pulls the plat map to approve your site plan, they'll see exactly what we saw. The HOA will get a formal notice of a zoning hearing because you're building adjacent to their actual property line. That's when the bomb goes off. I left Mark's office feeling like I was walking on air. I drove straight to the city building department. The clerk there was a bored-looking kid with a nose ring who didn't seem to care that I was about to start a suburban civil war. I handed over my site plan, a rough sketch of a two-story cabin positioned perfectly where the HOA's common area fire pit currently sat. Application fee is $300, the kid said, not looking up. We'll send out the notices to the adjoining neighbors by Friday. Hearing is in 2 weeks. I paid the fee and walked out. As I drove back past Oak Creek Estates, I saw a landscaping crew blowing leaves off the gravel path in my woods. I saw a young mother pushing a stroller toward the playground I now owned. For a second, I felt a twinge of guilt. These people didn't know their world was about to change. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. I wasn't an Oak Creek man. I was the man who owned their park. And by Friday, they were going to find out that their crown jewel was sitting on my nightstand. In the suburbs, news doesn't travel by the speed of light. It travels by the speed of the Nextdoor app. I was sitting in my kitchen on Friday morning, staring at a lukewarm cup of coffee, when my phone started buzzing so hard it rattled the table. It wasn't a call. It was a notification from the local community group. The title was in all caps. Emergency. Illegal development in Common Area A. I clicked it. Underneath was a blurry photo of the city's official yellow Notice of Proposed Land Use sign. My crew, well, the 2 guys I'd hired for the morning, had hammered it into the rubberized mulch right in front of the HOA's $50,000 cedar play structure at 7 a.m. The comments were a bloodbath. Is this a joke? Someone is trying to build a house in our park? Where is Candace? Someone call the board. I didn't have to wait long. By 10 a.m., my lawyer, Mark, called. The city just got 15 frantic phone calls from the same law firm in 20 minutes, he said, sounding entirely too pleased with himself. The Oak Creek HOA has officially requested an emergency hearing. They're claiming the city made a mistake by issuing your permit. What did the city say? I asked. The city told them that according to the 1998 master plat and the 2002 tax seizure, the HOA doesn't own the land. Apparently, there was a lot of shouting on the other end of the line. I spent the afternoon at a local print shop. I didn't just want a sign, I wanted a statement. When I drove back to Heritage Way at 4 p.m., the cul-de-sac was packed. There were 3 SUVs idling at the curb, and a group of about a dozen residents huddled near the trailhead like they were mourning a fallen soldier. And there, right in the center, was Candace Johnson. She was wearing a blazer this time, looking less like a tennis pro and more like a CEO about to fire a failing department. I pulled my sedan up behind a shiny Range Rover and stepped out. I was carrying a rolled-up vinyl banner and a staple gun. The conversation stopped instantly. 12 pairs of eyes, most of them filled with pure, unadulterated confusion, locked onto me. Mr. Gordon, Candace said, stepping forward. Her voice was surprisingly calm, but it was the calm of a hurricane's eye. I assume this is some sort of tactical stunt to get a settlement. It's clever, in a very desperate sort of way. But the city's zoning department has clearly suffered a technical glitch. It's not a glitch, Candice, I said. I walked past her toward the wooden entrance sign. It's a missing zero. Page 11 of the 1998 transfer deed. You should check it. Your lawyers certainly have by now. I didn't wait for her to respond. I climbed onto the cedar post and stapled my new banner directly over the gold leaf "Welcome to Common Area" a sign. The new sign was simple. Private property. Future site of the Gordon residence. All structures subject to removal. A younger woman in Lululemon leggings gasped. You can't take the playground. My kids play there every day. I'm not taking it, I said, looking down at her. It's already mine. It was attached to the land when I bought it at the tax auction, along with the gazebo and the fire pit. This is absurd, a man in a golf shirt shouted. We pay $400 a month in dues for that park. We've paid for the insurance on that equipment for 20 years. Then you've been paying to insure my property, I said. And I'd check with your treasurer about where that money has been going, because the city hasn't seen a cent of property taxes on this grove since the turn of the century. Candace's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. She looked at the residents, then back at me. We are filing an injunction. You won't lay a finger on a single tree, Mr. Gordon. We will tie you up in court until you're bankrupt. I'm sure you'll try, I said, stepping down from the sign. But while you're doing that, I suggest you tell your residents to stop using my fire pit. I'd hate to have to file a police report for trespassing on my first day as a neighbor. As I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror. Candace was standing perfectly still, staring at the missing zero in her world, while the rest of the neighborhood started to realize that the common area they had been paying for was actually just a gift they'd been building for a stranger. The emergency meeting was set for Monday, and I knew exactly what I was bringing: a surveyor's tape and a very loud whistle. The community center at Oak Creek Estates was exactly what you'd expect: vaulted ceilings, faux Tuscan chandeliers, and a smell that was a heady mix of expensive floor wax and old money. Usually, this place hosted wine tastings, Landscape of the Month awards, and polite debates over the acceptable shade of beige for a perimeter fence. Tonight, it felt like a war room. I walked in with Mark, my lawyer. He was carrying a briefcase that looked like it had seen its fair share of high-stakes litigation, scuffed at the corners, but heavy with the weight of 1,000 settled scores. We were greeted by a sea of hostile faces. About 50 residents, most of whom looked like they'd just been told their favorite country club was being turned into a municipal landfill. At the front of the room, sitting behind a long, polished mahogany table, was the HOA board. Candace Johnson sat in the dead center, flanked by two men in charcoal suits who looked like they'd been carved out of granite. One of them was their lead counsel, a guy named Henderson who had partner at a top-tier firm written all over his silk tie and his perfectly groomed salt and pepper hair. This meeting is now in session, Candace said, her voice amplified by a microphone that gave it a chilling, metallic edge. She didn't look at me. She looked through me, as if I were a smudge on a window she intended to have cleaned. We are here to address the fraudulent and predatory claim on Common Area A by a Mr. Joseph Gordon. Mark leaned over and whispered, "Let her use the big words, Joe. The higher they climb, the further they fall when the floor gives way." Henderson, the HOA's lawyer, stood up. He adjusted his glasses with the practiced grace of a man used to winning rooms. He looked at the crowd with a reassuring, fatherly smile. "Neighbors, let's be clear. Real estate law isn't just about a typo on a piece of paper from 25 years ago. The law is a living thing. It rewards those who care for the land. For over 2 decades, this HOA has acted as the sole, undisputed owner. We have mowed, we have paved, we have built a world-class playground, and we have paid every insurance premium." He turned his gaze toward us, his voice hardening into a legal blade. Under the doctrine of adverse possession, even if there was a technical error in the 1998 deed, the HOA has earned ownership through open, notorious, and continuous use. We have been the squatters for 20 years, and by law, that land is now ours. Mr. Gordon's tax deed is a flimsy piece of paper. Our 20 years of sweat equity is the indisputable reality. A murmur of approval rippled through the room. One man in a golf shirt actually clapped. Candice nodded, a small, triumphant smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. She thought she'd found the gotcha. Mark stood up slowly. He didn't use a microphone. He didn't need one. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "That's a very moving speech, Mr. Henderson," Mark said, his voice casual, almost bored. "And in a dispute between two private neighbors, say over a misplaced garden shed, you might even have a case, but you're forgetting one very large, very orange detail that changes everything." He pulled a document from his briefcase and slapped it onto the overhead projector. It was the 2002 Notice of Seizure from the city of Riverside. The city seized this land in 2002 when Miller Vein went under. From 2002 until last Tuesday, this grove wasn't private property. It was municipally owned land held for unpaid taxes. It was the king's dirt. Mark looked Henderson dead in the eye, his voice dropping an octave. "Have you ever heard of the legal maxim Nullum Tempus occurret regi? It means no time runs against the king. In this state, and almost every other in the Union, you cannot claim adverse possession against the government. The 20-year clock you're talking about? It never started. You can mow the king's grass for a century. You can paint his trees gold, but it still belongs to the king until he decides to sell it." The room went deathly silent. Henderson's granite expression cracked. He looked down at his notes, his fingers twitching toward the 1998 plat map. He knew. He'd seen the date of the city's seizure, but he'd hoped we hadn't. "The city owned that land," Mark continued, turning to face the crowd of residents. "And the city sold it to my client in a legal, public auction. All those dues you paid for maintenance, all those thousands of dollars spent on that cedar playground, legally speaking, you were just improving a public park. You were volunteers. And now that Joe has bought the land from the king, he owns every single bolt, slide, and gazebo you so graciously installed on someone else's property. That can't be right," a voice called out from the back. It was the woman in the yoga gear I'd seen at the trailhead. "We paid for that. It's our money. My kids play there." "It was your money," I said, standing up for the first time. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked straight at Candace. "But your board spent it on land they didn't check the title for. You built a kingdom on a cloud, and now the wind has changed. You've been paying to maintain my backyard for 20 years. Candace gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard her knuckles turned a bloodless white. "This isn't over, Mr. Gordon. We will file for an injunction. We will sue for unjust enrichment. You think you can just walk in here and take our park?" "I didn't take it," I said, picking up my folder and nodding to Mark. "I bought it at an open auction that was advertised in the paper for 3 weeks. You just weren't paying attention because you thought you were untouchable. You thought a missing zero didn't matter because you were Oak Creek." As we walked out, the silence in the room was replaced by a low, angry buzzing, the sound of 50 wealthy people realizing they'd been sold a lie. It wasn't directed at me anymore. I could hear the residents' voices rising, and they were all turning toward the mahogany table. They were starting to ask the one question Candace couldn't answer. How did the board miss this for 23 years? Outside, the air was cool and crisp. Mark slapped me on the back, a wide grin on his face. "The Nullum Tempus hammer," he laughed. "It's the legal equivalent of a tactical nuke. But get ready, Joe. Now that they know they can't win on the law, they're gonna get mean. People like Candice don't lose gracefully." I looked toward the dark, jagged outline of the grove in the distance. "Let them," I said. "I've got a surveyor coming at dawn. I think it's time to put up a fence." The sun hadn't even cleared the gables of the McMansions on Heritage Way when the first stake went into the ground. I stood at the edge of the grove with Bill, a surveyor who looked like he'd been carved out of hickory and old tobacco. He didn't care about homeowners associations or crown jewels. He cared about satellites and iron pins. "You're sure about the coordinates, Bill?" I asked, my breath misting in the cold morning air. "Son, I've got a GPS rig linked to the county base station and a 1922 brass monument at the creek," Bill grunted, hammering a wooden stake topped with neon pink ribbon into the center of the gravel path. The typo in the deed stopped their line 1,800 feet back. "Everything from this stake to the water is yours, including that gazebo they're so proud of." By 7:30 a.m., the sound of the sledgehammer had acted like an alarm clock for the neighborhood. The first curtain twitch happened at the Santis' house. 5 minutes later, the back door of Candace Johnson's French provincial swung open. She didn't have her tennis skirt on today. She was in a black power suit, clutching a leather portfolio like it was a buckler. She wasn't alone. Behind her trailed three other board members and a man in a high-visibility vest who I assumed was their own surveyor. "Stop exactly where you are," Candace shouted, her voice echoing off the silent houses. "We have filed for an emergency injunction. You are desecrating private community assets." Bill didn't even look up. He just moved 20 feet to the left and drove another stake into the safety mulch beneath the swing set. "Morning, Candace," I said, leaning against an oak tree. "Bill's just marking the corners. I figured since I'm paying the property taxes now, I should know exactly where my backyard begins." "This is an outrage," one of the board members, a man named Miller, sputtered. He pointed at the pink ribbon tied to the swing set. "That equipment cost $50,000. You can't just pin it like a butterfly." "I'm not pinning it, Mr. Miller," I said. "I'm claiming it. According to the law of fixtures, this playground is now part of my real estate. If you want to use it, you're technically trespassing." The HOA surveyor stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. He checked his own digital readout, looked at Bill's rig, and then looked at the 1998 plat map in his hand. He walked over to Candace and whispered something in her ear. Candace's face went from pale to a splotchy, indignant red. "And what does that mean?" she hissed, loud enough for me to hear. "It means he's right, Mrs. Johnson," their surveyor muttered, pulling his cap lower. "The iron pin is right where he put the stake. The missing zero is real. This land, it isn't in your deed." The silence that followed was heavy. The neighborhood had begun to gather at the edge of the cul-de-sac. Moms in SUVs, retired men in bathrobes, all watching the Queen of Oak Creek lose a border war in real time. "Get off the equipment!" Candace suddenly shrieked at a pair of kids who had wandered toward the slides. "The park is closed! Everyone, get back to your homes!" "Actually," I said, stepping forward, "the kids can stay for now. I'm not a monster, Candace. I'm just a guy with a deed. But I am going to need you to move your gazebo. It's blocking the view of where my living room is going to be." "You won't build a doghouse here," Candace vowed. Her eyes narrowed into slits. "We will sue you for every cent you have. We will claim unjust enrichment. You can't just inherit a $50,000 playground for free." "I didn't inherit it," I reminded her. "I bought it. At an auction you were too arrogant to attend. And as for unjust enrichment, you've had the use of a 3-acre forest for 20 years without paying a dime in taxes. I think the city is the one who got cheated, not you." Bill drove the final stake right through the middle of the stone fire pit. He wiped his brow and looked at me. "That's the line, Joe. You're pinned and flagged." I pulled a roll of yellow caution tape from my bag and began to string it between the stakes, wrapping it around the cedar posts of the playground. It looked like a crime scene. In a way, it was. The scene of a 20-year-old clerical error finally catching up to the world. As the HOA board retreated to Candace's patio to regroup, I saw several neighbors staying behind. They weren't looking at me with anger anymore. They were looking at the pink ribbons with a strange kind of awe. One man, a guy in his 30s holding a coffee mug, walked up to the yellow tape. "So," he said, nodding toward the grove, "you're really going to build a cabin in there? Right in the middle of her common area?" "That's the plan," I said. He looked back at Candace's house, then back at me, and let out a short, dry laugh. "Good luck, man. She's going to go nuclear." But honestly, most of us are just wondering why we've been paying $300 a month for park maintenance on land we didn't even own. The first crack in the HOA's armor had appeared, and I was just getting started with the sledgehammer. The nuclear option arrived on Tuesday morning in a thick, cream-colored envelope delivered by a process server who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. He didn't even look me in the eye as he handed it over. He just shoved the stack of papers into my hand, muttered, "You've been served," and practically jogged back to his car. The HOA wasn't playing with property lines or zoning ordinances anymore. They were playing with my bank account. The lawsuit was for unjust enrichment. The logic, drafted by Henderson's high-priced firm, was simple and devastatingly effective in its cold, legal phrasing. Even if I owned the dirt, the $50,000 playground, the $15,000 gazebo, and the $10,000 stone fire pit were improvements paid for by the honest, hard-working residents of Oak Creek. By keeping them, I was unjustly enriching myself at their expense. They wanted a $75,000 cash payout to make the community whole, or they wanted the equipment returned immediately in pristine condition. "They're trying to bleed you out, Joe," Mark said later that afternoon. He was leaning back in his leather office chair, tossing the legal papers onto his desk as if they were trash. They know you're a guy who just bought a job lot at a tax auction. They know you probably don't have $75,000 sitting in a shoebox. They want you to fold, panic, and sell the land back to the HOA for pennies on the dollar just to make the lawsuit go away. Can they win? I asked. My hands were shaking slightly as I gripped my coffee mug. I had $4,000 in the land, but $75,000? That was a life-ending debt. I mean, I'm keeping their playground. In a vacuum? A judge might find it sympathetic, Mark said, his eyes gleaming with the predatory delight of a man who loved a good fight. But the law doesn't live in a vacuum. You didn't sneak into their yard and steal that playground. They built it on land they didn't own because they were too arrogant to check their own deed. Under the law, they were voluntary interlopers. You don't get to build a swimming pool in your neighbor's yard by mistake and then send them a bill for the construction costs. In fact, we could sue them for the cost of removing the encroachments from your property. He paused, a slow, shark-like grin spreading across his face. But I think we can do better than just winning a dismissal. I called my brother-in-law, Elias. He's a forensic accountant and a tax strategist who spends his weekends reading IRS codes for fun. He found a loophole that's going to make Candace Johnson's head spin. Elias was a small, twitchy man who smelled of peppermint and old library paper. He joined us 10 minutes later, clutching a sleek laptop and a thermal mug that looked like it had seen the inside of many late-night offices. "Mr. Gordon?" Elias said, clicking open a complex spreadsheet. "Let's look at the math. You bought this at a tax auction, a job lot, for $4,200, correct?" "Yes," I said. "Every cent I had." "And the playground is commercial grade? Poured-in-place rubber safety mulch? Cedar timber with stainless steel fittings?" "It's the best money can buy," I confirmed. I saw the original receipts in the HOA's public filing. They spared no expense. Elias tapped a key, and a graph popped up on the screen. "Here's the beauty of it. Under the law of fixtures, you are the legal owner. But because this was a tax sale of abandoned property, your cost basis for that equipment, what you paid for it, is essentially zero. However, the IRS allows for a deduction based on fair market value if you've held the asset for more than 1 year." He looked at me over his spectacles, his voice humming with excitement. "If you wait until you've held the property for exactly 1 year and 1 day, you can donate that entire playground to a qualified 501(c)(3) charity, say an inner-city youth center or a local park in a lower-income district. At that point, you aren't limited to deducting what you paid for it. You can deduct the full appraised fair market value. In its current condition, probably $60,000. I blinked, doing the mental gymnastics. Wait, if I deduct $60,000 from my taxable income, at your projected tax bracket next year? Elias chirped. That deduction would reduce your actual tax bill by approximately $15,000 to $18,000 in cold, hard cash. You paid $4,000 for the land. The IRS would effectively be refunding you your purchase price, plus giving you an extra $10,000 or more in profit. The government is essentially paying for your new house's kitchen cabinets and flooring." Mark let out a bark of a laugh that echoed off the office walls. "Do you see it now, Joe? We don't settle. We don't pay them a dime. We tell the HOA that if they don't drop the unjust enrichment suit immediately, we're going to dismantle their precious crown jewel and donate it to the City of Riverside's Public Works. You get the hero headlines in the local paper, you get a massive tax windfall to fund your construction, and Candace gets to watch from her balcony as a crane lifts her $50,000 pride and joy onto the back of a flatbed truck." "And the lawsuit?" I asked, a grin finally breaking through my anxiety. "It dies the moment the equipment is gone," Mark said, leaning forward. "You can't be unjustly enriched by something you gave away to a charity for zero profit. We'd move for a summary dismissal before the first bolt was even unscrewed. They'd be left with nothing but a patch of bare dirt and a very expensive legal bill." I looked out the window, imagining the scene. I could almost see the playground from here, glowing under the afternoon sun. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, a symbol of the HOA's exclusivity. But now, it was a golden ticket. Candace had tried to use it as a shackle to lock me out of my own land, but she'd accidentally handed me the financing for my dream home. "Call the charity," I said, my voice steady and certain. "And tell the appraiser I want the most thorough valuation he's ever done. I want every single dollar those residents spent on dues to show up on my tax return as a gift from me." The Oak Creek man was officially a thing of the past. The strategic philanthropist had arrived, and I couldn't wait to see the look on Candace's face when she realized that her 20 years of meticulous maintenance had just paid for my new granite countertops. The leak was intentional. Mark called it litigation by PR. By Thursday afternoon, every resident in Oak Creek Estates had received an anonymous flyer in their mailbox, though anonymous was a stretch, considering it was printed on the same heavy bond paper Mark used for his legal briefs. Notice of relocation. Common area, equipment to be donated to the Riverside Boys and Girls Club. Dismantling begins Monday at 8 a.m. I stood on my porch, well, the temporary wooden platform I'd built over the stone fire pit, and watched the storm roll in. It wasn't a weather system. It was a fleet of luxury SUVs. By Saturday morning, the Grove looked like a protest camp. A group of about 15 parents, led by a woman named Sarah, who I recognized from the unjust enrichment meeting, had set up lawn chairs directly under the swing sets. They had coolers, umbrellas, and handmade signs that read, "Save our park and don't steal from our children." I stepped off my platform and walked toward the yellow caution tape I'd strung up days ago. The air was thick with the smell of expensive sunscreen and resentment. "Morning," I said, stopping at the line. Sarah stood up, her face tight with a mix of maternal fury and suburban indignation. "You're a monster, Joseph. My kids have been crying since they saw that flyer. You didn't pay for this equipment. You have no right to give it away like it's yours to give." "Legally, it is," I said quietly. "And I'm giving it to kids who currently play on cracked asphalt in a parking lot. Your kids have backyards the size of football fields, Sarah. I've seen them." "That's not the point," a man shouted from a beach chair. "We paid for this. It's a community asset." "Then you should have made sure the community actually owned the dirt it was sitting on," I shot back. "The city gave you 20 years to fix that typo. You ignored it." The crowd parted as a familiar white Lexus pulled up to the curb. Candace Johnson stepped out, looking like she'd spent the last 48 hours in a boardroom. She didn't look angry. She looked triumphant. She was followed by a local news crew, Channel 6, the On Your Side team. "Mr. Gordon," the reporter shouted, thrusting a microphone toward me as the cameraman started rolling. "How do you respond to the allegations that you're dismantling a beloved neighborhood park out of spite for a legal dispute?" Candace stepped into the frame, her voice pitched for the evening news. "It's a tragedy, really. We've offered Mr. Gordon a fair settlement to purchase the land, but he seems intent on destroying the joy of these children just to satisfy a personal vendetta." I looked at the camera, then at the parents sitting on the rubber mulch, and finally at Candace. She was good. She had turned a property dispute into a moral crusade. "Actually," I said, speaking directly to the lens, "I'm not destroying anything. I'm relocating it. I've partnered with the Riverside Boys and Girls Club. They're losing their city funding this year, and this commercial-grade equipment, which, according to the HOA's own lawsuit, is worth $75,000, will serve 500 kids who don't have a single blade of grass to call their own." I turned to the sit-in protesters. "If you stay here on Monday, you aren't stopping me. You're stopping those kids. And since this is private property, and I've already filed the quiet title action, the sheriff will be here at 8:05 to clear the site for the Cranes. I suggest you take your lawn chairs home before that happens." The reporter turned back to Candace, sensing a shift in the narrative. "Mrs. Johnson, is it true that the HOA hasn't paid property taxes on this land for over 2 decades? Is that why it was sold at auction?" Candace's professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second. She glared at the reporter, then at me. "The HOA's financial records are a private matter. We are focused on the children." "So am I said. "Just different children." As the news crew moved to interview the crying kids, clearly coached by their parents, I retreated back to my grove. I could hear the whispers starting among the protesters. The spite narrative was crumbling. I was no longer the man who stole a park. I was the man who was redistributing the HOA's accidental charity. But as I looked at Candace, she wasn't backing down. She was on her phone, her thumb flying across the screen. "Enjoy the spotlight, Joe," she called out as the news van started to pack up. "But remember, the donation only counts if the equipment leaves the property in one piece. And I've just instructed our groundskeeping crew to lock the private access gate at the end of the cul-de-sac. No cranes are getting through." She smiled, a slow, icy expression. "You might own the dirt, but we own the road." By Monday at 6 a.m., the entrance to Heritage Way looked like a checkpoint in a disputed territory. Candace had made good on her threat. Two massive iron gates, usually left open for the daytime, were chained shut. A private road, no unauthorized access sign had been freshly bolted to the bars. Beyond the gates, a phalanx of luxury SUVs was parked in a staggered formation, creating a mechanical slalom that no wide-body flatbed truck could possibly navigate. The human shield from the weekend had returned, bolstered by several dads in golf shirts who looked like they were ready to defend their cul-de-sac with their lives. Or at least their lawyers. I stood on my side of the yellow tape, drinking coffee from a thermos. Mark pulled up in his SUV on the public side of the gate, leaning out the window with a grin that told me he'd been up all night reading municipal codes. "They think they've won the blockade, Joe," Mark shouted over the gate. "Candace is currently inside her house telling the board that you're trapped." Candace stepped out onto her porch, holding a ceramic mug. She waved it toward me, a mock toast. She'd won. Without road access, the heavy machinery needed to dismantle the cedar towers and the gazebo couldn't get in. The donation would fail, the equipment would stay, and she would use the delay to file another round of injunctions. "You're forgetting one thing, Candace," I yelled back, stepping toward the northern edge of my property. She walked down her lawn, stopping at the edge of the iron fence. "And what's that, Mr. Gordon? The laws of physics? You can't fly a crane over a private road, and you certainly can't drive it through the creek." "I don't need the road," I said. I pointed toward the northern boundary of the grove. Beyond the thicket of maples lay the state-protected creek, and beyond that was a narrow, overgrown strip of land, a paper road that the city had never paved, which connected directly to the county highway. "Mark found the old utility easement," I said, my voice carrying across the quiet morning air. "The city still owns the right-of-way through the backwoods. And since I'm a beneficial user with a valid building permit, the city gave me a temporary access license yesterday afternoon at 4:55 p.m. Right on cue, the sound of a heavy diesel engine began to rumble from the woods behind the houses. It wasn't coming from the cul-de-sac. It was coming from the north. A massive, all-terrain crane, its yellow arm folded like a praying mantis, crested the small hill near the creek. It was followed by two flatbed trucks bearing the logo of the Riverside Boys and Girls Club. They weren't using the HOA's private manicured streets. They were rolling through the mud and the brush of the public easement, bypassing the blockade entirely. The faces of the parents at the gate dropped. Sarah, the woman from the sit-in, looked at the iron gate she was defending, then back at the crane, now looming over the playground. "Wait!" she screamed. "You're going to destroy the grass. That's a protected wetlands buffer." "Actually," I said, "the city's environmental officer is in the lead truck. We're using temporary steel mats to protect the soil. Perfectly legal. Perfectly permitted." The crane swung its massive boom over the cedar play structure. A crew of 4 men in high-vis vests jumped out and began unscrewing the heavy bolts with pneumatic wrenches. The hiss-clack of the tools was the sound of the HOA's crown jewel being disassembled. Candace ran toward the yellow tape, her composure finally shattering. "Stop! This is theft! Henderson, call the police!" "The police are already here, Candace," I said, pointing to a cruiser that had pulled up on the public side of the gate. "They're here to make sure no one interferes with a legal donation to a city-chartered charity. If any of your residents step over this yellow tape to stop those men, they'll be arrested for interfering with a lawful business operation." The first slide, a long, yellow spiral, was lifted into the air. It dangled for a moment over the grove, a bright plastic middle finger to the houses surrounding it, before being lowered gently onto the flatbed. One of the dads at the gate threw his hat on the ground. "That's it. My kid's favorite park is on a truck because our board couldn't read a map." The sit-in began to dissolve. The parents realized they weren't heroes defending a park. They were just spectators at a moving sale. As the gazebo was hoisted up next, the heavy timber frame creaking in the slings, I looked at Candace. She was standing alone on her perfectly edged lawn. The queen had lost her border, her blockade, and now her park. "1 year and 1 day, Candace," I called out. "The appraisal came in this morning. $62,000. I'm going to name the new kitchen the Johnson Wing in your honor." The courthouse on Monday morning didn't have the manicured charm of Oak Creek Estates. It was all linoleum floors, buzzing fluorescent lights, and the heavy metallic scent of industrial cleaner. But for me, it was the most beautiful building in the world. Judge Aristone didn't look like a man interested in suburban drama. He was 80 years old, with eyebrows like overgrown briar patches and a voice that sounded like gravel grinding in a mixer. He flipped through the thick stack of papers on his bench: the 1998 plat, the 2002 tax seizure, and the 300-page quiet title petition Mark had filed. Candace sat at the opposite table, flanked by Henderson and two other lawyers who looked like they hadn't slept since the Crane arrived in the Grove. Behind them, the gallery was packed. But the unified front of Oak Creek had cracked. The residents weren't sitting together. One group, the Loyalists, sat behind Candace. The other, much larger group sat on the far left, led by Sarah and the dad who'd thrown his hat. "Mr. Henderson," the judge barked, not looking up from the vellum map. "I've read your brief on unjust enrichment. You claim Mr. Gordon has been unjustly enriched by the presence of a playground on his land. A playground that, according to the affidavits I received this morning, no longer exists on said land." Henderson stood up, his collar looking a bit too tight. "Your Honor, the act of removing the equipment was a bad faith maneuver to avoid a settlement. The value of those improvements was created by the HOA's dues-paying members. Improvements made to land the HOA didn't own," the judge countered. He finally looked up, his eyes locking onto Henderson. "In 23 years, did no one at your firm or on this board think to perform a simple title search? A missing zero isn't a legal mystery, Mr. Henderson. It's a clerical error that any first-year paralegal should have caught during the first fence line dispute." He turned his gaze to Candace. She sat perfectly still, her chin tilted up, but I could see the slight tremor in her hands. "The law of this state is clear," Judge Aristone continued. "The doctrine of Nullum Tempus protected this land while it was in the city's hands. Adverse possession is off the table. The quiet title action is hereby granted. Joseph Gordon is the sole, fee simple owner of parcel 4509. A collective gasp went up from the gallery. Mark squeezed my shoulder so hard I thought he'd bruise me. "Furthermore," the judge added, his voice rising over the murmurs, "the court finds the HOA's lawsuit for unjust enrichment to be without merit. You cannot sue a man for enrichment when you are the ones trespassing on his property for 2 decades. In fact, Mr. Gordon would be within his rights to sue this HOA for back rent and the cost of land restoration." "We intend to appeal," Candace shouted, standing up before Henderson could stop her. "This is a theft of community identity. That land was promised to us. Promised by a bankrupt developer 25 years ago, Mrs. Johnson," the judge snapped. "The court suggests you spend your energy auditing your own books instead of filing frivolous appeals. Case closed." The gavel hit the wood with a sound like a gunshot. As we filtered out into the hallway, the quiet title was no longer the only story. The group of rebel residents converged on Candace before she could reach the elevators. "Is it true, Candace?" Sarah demanded, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "Is it true we've been paying for liability insurance on land we didn't own? Where did that money go? Who authorized the $50,000 for the playground without a title search?" "We acted in good faith," Candace hissed, trying to push past them. "Good faith doesn't cost us $300 a month," the man in the golf shirt yelled. "I want a full forensic audit of the HOA accounts for the last 10 years, and I want your resignation by 5 o'clock. I stood by the water fountain with Mark, watching the scene unfold. For months, I had been the villain of Heritage Way. Now, I was just a spectator to a suburban coup. Candace's eyes met mine across the crowded hallway. There was no condescension left, no Oak Creek polish, just the raw, naked fury of a woman who had lost her grip on the world. She didn't say a word. She just turned and fled toward the stairs, pursued by the very neighbors she had claimed to protect. "Well, Joe," Mark said, tucking his briefcase under his arm, "the title is quiet. The HOA is in a civil war, and you've got a donation receipt for $62,000 in your pocket." "It's quiet," I agreed, "but I think it's about to get a lot louder on my land." "How so?" "I'm calling the lumber yard," I said, looking out the window toward the sun. "I want the foundation poured by Friday. The smell of fresh cedar is the smell of victory." 6 months after the hammer fell in Judge Aristone's courtroom, my cabin was finally standing. It wasn't a sprawling mansion like the neighbors, but it was honest. It was all glass, dark metal, and reclaimed wood, nestled right in the center of the grove where the $50,000 playground used to be. I sat on my cantilevered back deck, nursing a cup of black coffee. The spot where the stone fire pit once sat was now my foundation. The gravel path had been replotted into a private driveway, and the high-end rubber mulch. I'd scraped it all up and sent it to the Boys and Girls Club along with the equipment. Now, the forest floor was returning to its natural state, ferns, moss, and the occasional wildflower poking through the dirt. The quiet title lived up to its name. The grove was silent. I heard the crunch of gravel. I didn't turn around. I knew the rhythm of that walk. It wasn't the heavy, purposeful stride of a construction worker or the hesitant shuffle of a curious neighbor. It was a walk that had lost its rhythm. It doesn't meet the setback requirements of the Oak Creek Architectural Committee, a voice said. I turned. Candace Johnson was standing at the edge of my new driveway. She looked different. The crisp tennis whites were gone, replaced by a simple linen dress. The sharp silver bob was a little longer, a little less structured. She wasn't the president anymore. The rebel faction had ousted the entire board 3 months ago, triggering a forensic audit that was still uncovering years of clerical oversights. Good thing I'm not in the HOA then, I said, leaning back in my chair. The city inspector signed off on the certificate of occupancy yesterday. To them, I'm just a guy on a 3-acre remnant lot. Candace walked to the edge of my porch, looking up at the modern lines of the cabin. She looked at the trees, the ancient oaks she'd claimed to protect but never legally owned. They're talking about a special assessment, she said, her voice devoid of its usual frost, to cover the legal fees from your case and the lost insurance premiums. Some of the neighbors are selling. Property values are adjusting. That's the risk of building a kingdom on a typo, Candace, I said. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the woman behind the blazer. She wasn't just a villain. She was a person who had tied her entire identity to a border that didn't exist. Was it worth it? All this trouble for a few acres of woods? I reached into the pocket of my flannel shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was my final tax return for the year. The IRS accepted the donation valuation, I told her. $62,000 for the equipment, the gazebo, and the site prep. Between that deduction and the low auction price, the government effectively cut me a check for $8,000 to live here. You didn't just give me the woods, Candace. You and the HOA paid for my kitchen cabinets and this very deck we're standing on. She stared at the paper. The irony seemed to settle on her shoulders like a physical weight. The Oak Creek man she had looked down on had used her own elite dues to finance his lifestyle. I'm moving, she said quietly. I sold the French Provincial. Closing is next week. Where to? A condo downtown, she said. No yard, no common areas, no trees to worry about. She turned to leave, but stopped at the edge of the woods. She looked back at the grove, the jagged tooth of green that had stayed hidden for 25 years. It is a nice view, Joseph. I'll give you that. It's a great view, I agreed, especially when you know exactly where the line is. I watched her walk away until her figure disappeared behind the houses of Heritage Way. I took a sip of my coffee. In the distance, I could hear a woodpecker knocking against a maple tree. I looked down at the floorboards of my deck. They were solid. They were legal. And most importantly, they were mine. I stood up, walked inside my new kitchen, the one the HOA had inadvertently bought for me, and started making breakfast. The sun was hitting the creek to the north, turning the water to silver. The missing zero was gone. The gap in the fence was closed, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for ghosts in a spreadsheet. I was home. And that's Joseph's story. And if you made it this far, I'd appreciate you dropping a like and maybe throw in a comment to let me know what other HOA stories you'd like to hear. Hope that you have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you all next time.